Hello class, and welcome to the overview of Chapter 2, Where to Start. Here is that pesky disclaimer again. Please make sure that you do not use the slides for any other reason besides your participation in this class. Okay, so what we are going to be talking about in terms of learning objectives for this chapter. We will try to draw a linkage between how research questions, hypotheses, and predictions are related. Next, we will discuss the different ways that people develop ideas for research, including common sense ideas, basic observations, theories, utilizing past research, and trying to find solutions to practical problems. We will identify at least two functions of the theory. We will then describe the three basic kinds of research reports. Then we will go part by part over the different informational sections within a research article, such as the abstract, introduction, method, results, and discussion sections of research articles. And then we will talk a little bit about exploring different search engines and finding research in psychology using tools like PsycInfo. One thing that a lot of people don't understand very well, especially those who are not informed consumers of research, is the relationship between research questions, hypotheses, and predictions. It has been my experience that a lot of folks tend to mix these things up and don't understand the distinction between these different concepts. Step one in this process is the development of a research question. From the Chapter 1 video lecture, we might have been able to form a research question about whether there is a relationship between playing violent video games and aggressive behavior. So a more formal research question would be, is there a relationship between playing violent video games and aggressive outcomes? Notice that the question is specific and testable. This is not the same as a hypothesis. A hypothesis actually tries to answer the research question. So, taking this example a little bit further, a hypothesis would sound something more like there is a direct relationship between playing violent video games and aggressive outcomes. To take things one step further is an actual prediction. Depending on what we think the likely outcome would be, we might try to make a prediction such as saying, there is a positive direct relationship between playing violent video games and aggressive outcomes. Meaning, the more a person plays violent video games, the more likely there is to be aggressive outcomes. So, the prediction actually makes a guess about the outcome of the study, and it is testable, related to the hypothesis at hand, and uses specific variables. So if you take note of the relative difference between a research question, a hypothesis, and a prediction, what we know is that research questions are clearly the most broad way to think of a topic that we would want to study. As we develop a hypothesis, we develop a more specific question, and then when we make a deliberate guess about what the answer to that question might be, then we are being even more specific by making a specific prediction. So, in this slide, what we are talking about is a very broad statement about whether there's big differences among groups in terms of cell phone use, while driving to a hypothesis about whether males and females are somehow different in their use of cell phones while driving, and then to a more specific prediction that females are somehow more likely to use a cell phone while driving as compared to males. So here we see the difference between something that is much more vague in a research question and something that is quite a bit more specific when we make a prediction. How do we generate ideas for research in the first place? Well, some of these ideas might seem like common sense, but in reality, there are quite a few common sense ideas that actually don't pan out in research. The reverse is also true, though, that sometimes research does support common sense ideas, but we would not know the difference if we hadn't actually tested these ideas. Sometimes research is motivated by people's desire to solve practical problems. This reminds me of the silly television infomercials where people try to sell products to solve problems that people didn't even know they had in the first place. Just kidding. There are tons of practical problems that people might encounter in the real world, And this should hopefully motivate people to develop research ideas for how to solve these problems, or maybe even at least minimize these problems. Sometimes ideas for conducting research is based on our own observations, and this makes me think about how behavior analysts might notice something unique about unusual human behavior and ask questions about what the purpose might be for that behavior. Obviously, this is a really simplistic way to describe it, but there are lots of different observations we can make about human behavior that might be worth researching. Obviously, there are oodles of theories in psychology, and lots of famous psychologists in the history of our field have developed some pretty interesting theories. But as we know, theories are only theories until they're tested. Finally, new research ideas often spring from past research. For example, if we want to use the violent video game example again, perhaps future researchers might ask the question if bad behavioral outcomes are related to any kind of video game playing at all, let alone violent video games. Let's not overlook the importance of the theoretical background for developing ideas for research. I think many theorists get a bad rap for having good ideas that are not always testable or sensible. The truth is that theories help to organize and explain behavior, which in turn helps us to generate new knowledge. Next, let's talk about the different types of research reports that we commonly encounter. Literature reviews provide summaries of previous research on a particular topic. This is probably one of the most time-consuming types of reports, especially if there are literally hundreds and hundreds of articles that you have to sift through in order to create the summary. This really does depend on whether a researcher is expanding upon existing ideas or whether the research is doing something very new and unique where no previous research on the topic might exist at all. A similar concept is a review called the meta-analysis, and this is similar to a literature review because it examines all the research in a specific area that has been conducted in the past and actually takes that a step further. Rather than just explaining past research, it actually uses complex statistical procedures to analyze all the previous results of other studies and then draw even newer conclusions. Theory articles are certainly interesting because they discuss research that has oftentimes already been conducted, and then they try to use that information to build a conceptual framework to help people understand certain ideas. One really interesting example of this is how forensic psychologists have retrospectively examined cases of individuals convicted of stalking and then tried to develop a framework for understanding that sort of behavior. So as you can see, developing a theory that summarizes and integrates previous information helps us understand a concept. Individual studies conducted in psychology are eventually written into articles called empirical research articles. So to use the same example I keep talking about, if you wanted to do a laboratory study on children and observe the ones that are playing violent video games versus those who do not, and then record violent or aggressive outcomes afterwards, this would be an excellent scenario to describe in an empirical research article. There are several sections that compose a typical empirical article. There's generally always going to be an abstract, an introduction or literature review, a method section, a results section, and a general discussion. I'm probably biased, but I think the abstract is probably my favorite part of the article and the best part of the article. The reason I say that is because sometimes reading an entire article can be pretty tedious and time consuming, and I'm not always sure that by the time I get done reading it, I was spending my time wisely. And that's time I can't get back. So reading an abstract or a summary of the research report is often a way to sort of get an idea of whether I want to dig into the article further to understand what the researchers found. So an abstract is really just a brief synopsis of the entire paper, more or less. The introduction or literature review is the researcher's attempt to explain to the reader what the past research has shown, perhaps what theories are being tested, and essentially try to tell a story about how all this previous research has led to the present moment, including why there might need to be a study in a new area proposed by the current researcher. This is usually the area of the paper where the researchers would discuss what their expectations are, what their predictions are, and include some formal hypotheses. The methods section contains information that details the exact procedures used. This is super important information because it tells the reader exactly what these researchers did, so that if other researchers tried to replicate this study, that they could do it. This would include a description of how the study was designed from beginning to end, what types of participants they used, such as maybe how they found people or how they recruited them for the study. Also, what types of procedures they used to get the data. And also there is a description of any type of questionnaires or maybe apparatus or other type of equipment they might have used. In the results section, there is typically a description of the statistical language that describes what the outcome of the study was. I've often found that this is usually the most difficult part of the article to read, which is why having a background in statistics is so vitally important. To help readers understand, researchers will also often include tables, graphs, or other visual aids to help the reader understand what these numerical findings are. Finally, the discussion section contains information about whether the researchers might have made some mistakes, what some limitations were in terms of the applicability of their outcomes, whether their results were similar or different to previous researchers' results, and best of all, a good discussion section should telegraph to the reader where they think the focus should be for future studies. Okay, in this next section, we'll talk a little bit about how to get access to research articles by using online databases. So the number one tool that most psychologists use is a search engine called PsycInfo. I've been using this for many, many years because it contains a really good collection of references to a wide variety of journals across the whole array of subdisciplines in psychology. So for example, if you wanted to find articles that discuss therapeutic interventions for teenagers with depression, there's no doubt you would find hundreds, if not thousands, of articles from previous researchers on the topic in PsycInfo. Also, if you were curious about ADHD and whether there were any useful interventions with adults with this problem, you could also find a ton of articles in PsycInfo. So this database can be a little bit intimidating for new users because oftentimes new users simply don't know how to properly enter the search terms. But if you use the thesaurus of psychological index terms, this helps you to know how to enter phrases or terms that the search engine understands best. When conducting your research, you will almost always want to see the title of the article, who the authors were, what journal it was in, and have access to at least the abstract. One other cool feature that has been developed in recent years is the digital object identifier, and this makes online searches even better because it often contains a link to the full text article if you're interested. But of course, this is not the only search tool or engine that might be useful. Sometimes there are areas slightly outside of psychology that can have important information that could reasonably apply to the study that someone wants to conduct. ASU provides access to Web of Science and I believe Scopus, which are actually really neat tools because they can help you chase down related articles by searching the citations. And if you're super nerdy like me, this is kind of like going down a rabbit hole of looking at one article, which leads to another article, and then another article, and so on. So beware and try to remember to stay focused so that you don't get too far away from the key article that you began with. Last but not least, here are some other electronic search sources that have been developed in recent years that I have also found to be very useful. Although PsycInfo is already provided by the APA, the American Psychological Association, Sometimes there are limitations in access to specific articles in books and book chapters. So they developed specific tools to help narrow down the focus to specific types of literature that you might want to read. For example, Psych Books is a database that only has access to full text resources for sometimes entire books and sometimes just chapters. Other major databases that I've also found helpful is Sociological Abstracts, because sociology is in many ways very similar to psychology, and many sociologists study similar concepts even though they might have different theoretical notions. Medical journals are often useful when a researcher might want to study a concept in psychology that bridges over to other fields like medicine, biology, and so forth. One particular resource that I have also found useful in studying forensic psychology is LexisNexis, which oftentimes has access to legal journals and case law in addition to general media resources. Finally, Google Scholar is becoming an increasingly potent online tool to access scholarly articles, although you should consider yourself warned that there are sometimes so-called journals that publish quasi-research that is in fact not scholarly at all, so one has to be really careful when examining this information to determine its relative worth. Okay, folks, please make sure that you thoroughly read Chapter 2 and have a great week.